Today we're going to talk about something that used to annoy me as a teenager in a youth group and still annoys me to this day. Youth pastor friends, listen up. Say a young man or a young lady in your youth group comes to you. They have this innate desire for companionship, but for whatever reason, it just seems to evade them. And because the Christian church is so enamored with the mystical idea of God's will for their life, in the pagan world they call that destiny. Both they and you begin to accept the idea that perhaps divine intervention is barring their lives from companionship. Because after all, surely there are some people which God does not intend marriage and children for. So now that we've validated their hopeless outlook on life, let's give it lifeblood. Using what Bible verse? Well, I'm glad you asked. None other than 1 Corinthians 7:8. Why would that upset you? It specifically mentions the unmarried. Oh my gosh, you're right. Why did I never think of this? Not the context that Paul is speaking in. So if you want to find out more, go to part 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 8, part 2. In this passage, Paul says, I say to the unmarried and to widows, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. Well, he says unmarried and widows, and a widow is somebody whose spouse has already died, so unmarried must be something else, right? Wrong! But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's just analyze this real quick. Torah says to be fruitful and multiply. In the carnal sense, this would require and necessitate a marriage. By the way, this is not a suggestion, it is a command. If Paul were teaching against marriage in favor of a life of celibacy for all, Paul would be preaching against the Torah, and as per Deuteronomy 13, this would make him a false prophet. In addition, if the entire church followed Paul's teachings regarding this at this point, the church would never see beyond one generation. Aside from these, there are any number of other problems with the idea and notion that Paul is speaking to unmarried young people who have never been married before. So let's move on. What does Paul mean by unmarried, and how is it different from a widow? Well, if you've been to my channel before, you understand you're going to have to go to part 3 for that. 1 Corinthians 7:8, part 3. Paul here says that it's good for the unmarried and widows to remain so. Now here in the Western 21st century, we understand that the words widow and widower apply to a person whose spouse has died. However, in 1st century Eastern society, that was not so much the case. At least not for men. They weren't as culturally progressed as we are in terms of individuality. In fact, they were much more collectivist. Because men were the breadwinners in day-to-day society, if a woman's husband died, generally she lost her source of income. Without a husband to provide for her, she was either left destitute and in poverty, or she had to go and be a burden to other families. There are negative connotations that come with the word widow that do not apply to a man in this society. You see, in this society, if a man's wife died, his life might actually become a little harder, or even a lot harder. If the couple prior to the wife's death was fortunate enough to have a daughter, she would resume the mother's duties. The man would then continue working his daily job in normal life. He would never become really destitute the same way that a widow was. A man whose wife died is not called a widower. He's just unmarried. In light of the context of the surrounding verses of the passage, it's obvious Paul is talking about people whose spouses have died. It's generally accepted by scholars that Paul himself was an unmarried man, meaning that he had a wife and she had died at some point. So to put this passage in the 21st century common vernacular, Paul is encouraging widowers and widows to dedicate the rest of their lives to getting closer to God, rather than worrying about being married again. So let's stop using this passage to confirm a teen's ideas that God's will might be to deprive them of the one thing that they actually want in life. Sure, there are some that God has called to be eunuchs. Those are going to be people who don't even want families. If your teens want to be married and have a family, trust me, that's God's will for them. Because the Torah commands them to do it, and Torah is God's will. And as always, I hope this has blessed you. Shalom.